Good afternoon. Welcome. This is WUVS 103.7 The Beat, and this is Torn Into, your local news show. We're going to be looking for the truth like always today. However, we're going to be without our primary truth seeker, our leader, the irreplaceable Greg Roberts, is not able to be here today. And so he has thrown over to me, Professor David Takitaki. He refers to me as the professor. The keys to the kingdom here. We get to talk about Joe Biden. We get to talk about his address to the nation. And we get to talk about some of the bigger themes that seem to be emerging in the Biden presidency. Now, like any good academic given a last-minute assignment, the first thing that I did upon realizing that I'd be stepping in for Greg today is I reached out to another academic. You see, we run in packs and we tend to work together. So joining me today is going to be Dr. Philip Howe. Dr. Philip Howe is the chair of the political science department at Adrian College. He is an expert in comparative democracy, and he's the type of person who I thought will be a wonderful add to our conversation today, and also somebody who I just honestly really enjoy talking to. So if I can bring in at this point in time, Dr. Howe.
Howdy.
Phil, how are you, sir?
Pretty good. Good to see you again, Taki. Glad for, thanks for inviting me on. And as I was just telling you, everybody, this is my first TV show, my first radio broadcast. I must admit, my first time seeing this program. So hopefully I won't screw it up too badly.
Yes, well, I trust in your ability to think on your feet. You are a professor, of course, as I have led in and teaching at Adrian College. I have to note here, kind of as a point of history, that Phil was one of the people who was instrumental in kind of getting my teaching career off the ground, and so I'm always grateful to him and look forward to sharing his wisdom with our broader community. So we are here to talk about the Biden speech to an extent. And I don't think we can really jump into the Biden speech and its content without taking a second to address the historic moment that occurred at the very, very beginning of that speech. For the first time in the history of this great nation, the president looked over his shoulder and said, "Madam Speaker." And then he looked over his other shoulder and he said, "Mrs. Vice President." It wasn't hard. It was hard not to get a little emotional at that. Phil, what was your take?
That was part of my reaction as well, kind of for the exact same reason. That and the very shots of the second husband were also, or sorry, the second gentleman were also very striking in that regard. But yeah, I think I speak for a lot of people. It's been a long time coming.
Yes, I think so. I immediately started imagining the memes that would show the three of them there on the dais, and then like a progress bar at the bottom of the screen that was filled to 66%, right? Like we're 2/3 of the way there at this point. That's where my mind went when that happened. But once we got past that and the president started talking about what was going on in America, it became clear that this was going to be a State of the Union while not being a State of the Union, right? Generally, the first speech doesn't get called a State of the Union, probably because the president's only been in office for a little while. But Joe Biden is not new to this kind of work, is he, Phil?
No, he's not. And I don't claim to have an exact count, but in an odd way, former President Trump set the precedent for this of doing a quote-unquote State of the Union on his first year. I feel like this is different in a way. Just the usual reason to not have a State of the Union at the beginning is the assumption that you don't get anything done. And it seems pretty obvious to me that the president insisted on having one because he's gotten a lot done. So he actually, feels he has a right to his bragging rights after a mere 100 days.
Right. And that's another point that I think a lot of people have been talking about, that simultaneously, this feels like the Biden presidency just started, and it also feels like the election was 8 years ago. I'm not exactly sure how time is compressed in this pandemic land, but yeah, it's been 100 days, 100 days of this Biden administration. And he has and began by talking about a lot of the things that his administration has already accomplished. There's an argument to say that a lot of what he accomplished in the first 100 days was undoing a lot of what the previous administration had done. We saw a lot of those executive orders. Did any of those stand out to you as being significant?
Well, in a way, the scale of it in general strikes me as significant. I mean, I'm trying to recall what my expectations were after the Biden administration. It seems for a good cross sections of Democrats, there was trepidation or disappointment about Biden in the sense of, okay, we're getting people further on the left were perhaps concerned that we're getting a more moderate president. And on my end, I generally thought of his main task as sort of restoring faith in American government and, if you will, fixing things that have been broken. Specifically with the, fixing the Justice Department, putting the country's diplomacy back on the right footing, and on like that. And I think when he was first elected, my expectation was that, and maybe some policy goals. The sweepingness of what is that a word? Anyway, the scope of what he seems to be attempting so far in terms of the COVID bill, the jobs bill, the family bill, everything else is rather stunning. There seems to be a bit of wisdom that floats around that you should only attempt one big thing in your first term, and I don't know if he's following that rule.
I think you're right. He's thrown it out the window, basically.
The other thing I would add on that, one of the points I think in favor of Biden as the candidate now is simply he's in a unique position to step into the office right now. I mean, he has decades of experience as a senator. He has 8 years of experience as a vice president, meaning he's observed the presidency close at hand. I mean, in some ways, he probably knows things about passing legislation that even Nancy Pelosi doesn't know. And, whatever you think of her personally or ideologically, Nancy Pelosi is really good at getting legislation passed. It's stunning. I'm looking forward to several years from now reading whatever book people write about his transition, because I'm kind of curious how early all this stuff was actually put into place. Clearly, there's been a lot of advanced planning.
Right. In looking back, I have heard time and time again, and we even saw this with the Obama administration, that sometimes you get, that one big piece of landmark legislation. In case of the Obama administration, it was the Affordable Care Act. In the case of the Trump administration, it was his Tax and Jobs Act. You get one, and then political capital kind of dries up, and it becomes difficult to get anything done. I think one of the things that Biden has articulated and is accurate is that, even if he only wanted to get one, the country needs more than one at this point. And the first one that we saw out of the Biden administration was his significant COVID response. Wasn't the first COVID response that we've seen, but this one was designed and to a great degree successful in restoring an element of the American economy, in stimulating a great deal of spending. Almost everyone has, at this point in time, received, hopefully, for all of you out there in Radio Land, your $1,400 stimulus checks. And the vaccination effort that has gone along with this initial legislation out of the Biden administration has exceeded expectations. When Biden made his very grandiose sounding promise of vaccinating 100 million shots in his first 100 days, people thought that was a stretch. We've exceeded that number. We've doubled it and then some. We're at 220 million. I know my vaccination in the West Michigan area was relatively simple and relatively painless. How was yours on the east side of the state?
Mine was fine. I signed up. I'm calling in from Ypsilanti. I signed up with Washtenaw County. Did not wait that long. I just had my second Moderna a week and a half ago. I'm waiting till Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, at which point I become invulnerable.
Right. Yes. I'm looking forward to the superpowers. Yeah. So massive amounts of Americans have now been vaccinated. I think the president said 70% of seniors at this point in time have gotten their vaccinations. 50% of all adults have gotten at least one shot. And I think he correctly points out the fact that with the economic turmoil that we've seen as a result of the restrictions and health concerns around the pandemic, a lot of people found themselves in significant need for healthcare coverage. So much so that when he opened up the Affordable Care Act window, we saw 800,000 Americans now getting their healthcare through that portal. Healthcare is a big theme, I think, going forward for this administration and for the country. Do you think we've come to a point where America is ready to take the next step away from our system of healthcare and figure out something new?
Wow. I guess the honest answer is I don't know. I mean, we are, as you know, as I'm sure a lot of the audience knows, we're sort of an outlier that way. I mean, around the world, across dozens and dozens and dozens of other democracies, universal health care is taken for granted. I personally have trouble believing that it could not work in the United States, just because that happens to work in a lot of different circumstances. But it is a hard fight. I feel like the public support is there in a general sort of way, and I do feel like people are increasingly aware that there's another way of doing things. But the political will has sometimes been hard to come by.
Right. It's worth noting that people like former Senator Ted Kennedy spent half a lifetime trying to move this, and that the breakthrough of the Affordable Care Act was such a significant piece of legislation that to be discussing now, just a few years later, even more big changes is pretty significant. So the other big point that President Biden made about his COVID Recovery Act was specifically the part of it that looks at child poverty. We've got a unique kind of thing going on here where we've got a unprecedented new child tax credit, where something on the order of $3,600 for children under the age of 6 and $3,000 for children between 6 and the age of 18 have essentially become available. And just for the audience, because I don't know how many of you are political scientists or economists, this is what's known as a refundable tax credit, meaning that most tax credits can only reduce your liability to the government. I owed $1,000, but I got a $1,000 tax credit, so I'm even. If you'd have gotten a $1,500 standard tax credit with a $1,000 tax debt, that's it. You zero out, right? But if it's a refundable tax credit, that means that not only would you zero out the $1,000 you owed the government, but you'd get a check for $500, right? That's a big difference. So if you hear people talking about these tax credits and things like that, that term refundable is a really, really big deal. Well, this refundable tax credit is not only a unique object because it's a refundable tax credit, but at least in terms of the tax credit we're looking at receiving this calendar year, 2021, the Biden administration also put in legislation that makes it so that this is going to be paid out in payments to individual families starting this summer, right? The idea is to put money into the hands of families who need it. And so this is a very different kind of social program than we've seen in the United States previously in terms of this kind of a tax credit. The idea that people would be receiving a refundable tax credit in their pockets on a month-to-month basis in a calendar year, I can't think of any historical precedent for it. Phil, can you?
Not that I'm aware of. Not my area of expertise, I suppose, but no, not that I can think of.
Yeah, no, I can't think of anything like it either. So it's a pretty, I think, significant change. And I want to seize on this point, really, because this is a revisualization of what government does, right? The Reagan administration really repositioned a great deal of the way that Americans thought about their government, right? What was the quote? Something on the order of, this might have been a Norquist quote, but, government should be of such a size that it could be drowned in a bathtub, right?
Yeah, something along those lines.
Very, very oppositional to the idea of government as a force for good, right? Government was the problem. I mean, you've heard a lot of that rhetoric, Phil. Would you describe it?
Oh, yeah. And, not to show my age so much, but I remember that transition. I mean, it's, up through the 70s, it's still this. Up to the 70s, it was this period in American politics where you're seeing government programs, the like of which you don't even think anymore. Like attempts to guarantee employment for all U.S. citizens and that sort of thing. And Reagan was definitely a turning point. And in some extent, I'm a comparative political scientist. I don't primarily study the United States, but I think of this in global terms. That's that larger turn. I mean, it's Reaganism, it's Thatcherism, and it almost seems like around the globe, even in democracies with strong social democratic traditions, which is most democracies, you see social democratic and socialist parties starting to look a lot more like classical liberals and talking in terms of markets. And that might be shifting. I mean, we could argue there's a generational difference there. I mean, a lot of the polling data on younger people seems to show that. And, obviously the economic downturn in 2008, I think, has shaken up a lot of people's faith. But getting back to your point, there's definitely, I saw two big general things going on throughout Biden's speech, to get back on that. One was, the one that's relevant here is redefining what the role of government is. And I think partly he's trying to create this perception that, government can provide services and can do it competently. But also throughout his speech, there seemed to be this effort, sometimes put more awkwardly than it needed to be, but, it's Biden, but that the government is us. And he went out of his way to kind of say that. And, I think that's very important. If you think about it as sort of like, do you want the government doing this? People react a lot more negatively. But if it comes down to, do you want your taxes to go towards stuff that you want? Mm-hmm. And that's the sort of thing. I think there's a larger thing helping Biden in this regard. There's a headline, I can't quote verbatim, but I saw a couple of weeks ago that said something like, President Biden's strategy, do popular things and take credit for them.
Right, yeah.
And I think in ways it serves him right now that there's a lot of these policies are just really popular right now. The idea is to get them passed. You and I were talking earlier. The odd thing is, in a way, by doing them, he gets credit for them, but he's not framing them in terms of something he did. And this gets back to the government as us. He's kind of constantly talking about all these things and stuff we as a people are doing.
Yeah, no, I as a person who teaches American government, my heart sang when he made that comparison, because one of the things that I'm always emphasizing to people is that, essentially, functionally, America, our government, it's three things, right? It's the ideas, the Constitution, the statute law, the precedents that kind of comprise what we think of America to be. It's that intellectual material. It's the physical property, right? It's the buildings and the land and technically, the tanks and the guns and the bombs and all that stuff that is government property. And it's us, the American people. That's it. The three of them. And only one of them is walking around and talking, and it's the ability to work with the other two, right? It's right. It's the humans here. We are the government. Federal government employs millions and millions of people. There's 89,000 different units of government across the country. So to have that humanized, I think, is a big deal, because it's very easy to do the opposite, right? To think of the government as some kind of monolith, something that doesn't involve us. But I think the president's absolutely right, as are you, to point out that this is us. America is us more than anything else. So, and on those themes, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's us. So here we go. I mentioned there's two things I'm noting there. I mean, one is sort of redefining the role of government in a positive way, and what you were suggesting. I think that's trying to reverse the discourse about government that's existed since the Reagan years. There's another aspect, which is an attempt to define who we are. And that is not unique to Biden. In fact, one of the reasons I'm thinking about this so much is not relevant for this broadcast. My own research has a lot to do with nationalism and ethnic group politics in Central and Eastern Europe. I spent a lot of time not looking at political parties and looking at what kinds of group identities that they invoke. So general background here. I mean, I would argue that all political parties of all kinds do two things. They offer a package of policies that might appeal to voters, but they also try to define who we are or who their constituency is.
So that's a little bit of background there. I tend to look for those kinds of group identity claims, and let me name the three that jumped out repeatedly from Biden's speech. Americans, the middle class, and working families.
Mm-hmm.
And all very striking in that they tend to be, especially Americans in the most obvious ways, they tend to be very unifying claims. And in that sense, I mean, I think he's trying to do something that, well, Obama tried 12 years ago. We'll see if it's more successful right now, which is sort of define America as being above its own divisions.
Right.
And also, I think he's contrasting to the kind of politics that's defining us as not immigrants or, not Muslim, or, there's a lot of other ways to define us, and he's definitely pushing back against that.
Yeah, no, and I think that's absolutely accurate, not only because of Biden's attempted, articulation of this vision, but yes, precisely because of the fact that it was the practice of the previous administration to have a more exclusionary definition, right, of what America was, or maybe what it was supposed to be. And that is significant contrast. So in defining kind of this new America with this new idea of government, Biden points maybe a little bit pre-Reagan to an extent to talk about the way in which public investment changes things. He talked about the railroads and the highways and the space program and the role that government research had in inventing the internet. And I think his comment was that, one, only the government was in a position to make these kinds of broad, sweeping, sometimes risky investments. And on top of that, these investments spurn the economy, right? Not only do they create major industries and create different ways that individuals within the economy can interact with each other, they lower transaction costs and things along those lines, but they employ people, right? That's kind of the vision he's trying to put forward here. So I think if we combine the idea of this vision of government as us, government can do things for us, and us is, as you suggested, is all of America, families, and the middle class. That is a very broad vision and a very kind of specific mandate, don't you think?
Yeah, if I could add, middle class is also in American politics is a wonderfully broad category. And basically everybody from blue collar workers up to the Bush family describe themselves as middle class. Mm-hmm. And, I'm mocking a little bit, but in some ways it's a politically very useful category. But I think it's also a deep part of our culture. Everyone thinks of themselves as middle class or aspiring to the middle class.
Right.
Even Bernie Sanders, again, never done a word count, I suspect uses the word middle class much more than he says workers. So,
Right. Yeah. And the workers are an undertone for like Biden's entire speech, right? The idea is that
absolutely
these things are going to create jobs, and we as workers will then benefit from them, right? Because that's what we are. We're workers, right? So the fact that 2 million women dropped out of the workforce, right, during the pandemic is a big issue. And trying to figure out how we can tackle that kind of a problem, right? Previous philosophy would have been something on the order of, cut regulations and cut taxes, and essentially the upper end of the spectrum, the job creators, then will be more unshackled to do what they do and create jobs, and that's how we're going to build our way out of this. Biden's articulating a different vision here, and it's something we've done before, right? This kind of public investment. This is not unique to us. So
yeah, and a couple comments on that. I mean, one is I find the phrase "working families" kept jumping out at me. Wonderfully well chosen. I always tend to analyze the rhetoric behind this stuff. Former debater, and also because part of the job is to frame things. Working families is a wonderful phrase, right? Because everyone's pro-family, or at least says they are. And it's a very inclusive thing, right? I mean, it's kind of seems to me to have this implication that working families include working mothers, working, fathers, it covers that broad range. And when you talk about this being a much older vision, yeah, I mean, I don't know how much Biden is doing this directly, but the two comparisons I'm hearing over and over and over, say online, are Johnson and FDR.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always in the terms of people arguing about whether this is as big as what Johnson accomplished. And well, not so far, but we'll see.
Right. I think there's a definite parallel to both of the things, both the scope in terms of FDR's administration and also the element of recovery, but also, with the Johnson administration, especially, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, but in regards to things like voting and civil rights expansion, the idea that you were coming out of kind of a significant tragedy, right, in the Kennedy assassination, gave a degree of fuel to these efforts to right a significant wrong in terms of limited access to the polls for Americans. And it's interesting that we should find ourselves in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection in a similar position right now, right? Where it's in many ways the structure of that tragedy that's kind of moving forward some of the stuff that President Biden is talking about. We got a comment from the community here. What would you say middle income is in Muskegon County? I'll tackle that first because as Phil area, he's over there in Washtenaw County. So just as a quick point of reference, by our gross domestic product per capita, the American average ends up boiling out to being something on the order of about $57,000 per annum. That's your midpoint for the United States. Muskegon County, as everybody who lives in it knows, has a large manufacturing history, has a large lumber history, and a lot of those have been the industries that have been the hardest hit. I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but I know that similar communities across the country can see a median income between $28,000 and $32,000 per annum. So without having data in front of me, that would be my initial guesstimate. And that means that, you're going to have, of workers, you're going to have people who are equally distributed above and below that point, right? So there are plenty of people who are making, good wages and are bringing in, in excess of $50,000, close to the national average. But I think we all know people in the community who are making do off of minimum wage. In terms of our service employees, people are making do off of less than minimum wage, and who haven't had a chance to work in quite some time, right? Or at least not the number of hours they normally would work without the number of tipped incomes they would normally enjoy. So that would be my initial estimate to talk back to our viewer of where the county probably is. Controlling for the pandemic, controlling for other elements of job displacement to try to get you to an exact number, that's really hard. And again, without having better data in front of me, I can't make that guess. But if I got data back that said it was in that $32,000 range as a net county average, I would not be surprised. So income obviously is a big deal, right? That's literally how we pay the bills. So one of the things that President Biden has kind of thrown out there, and while this is not a specific, I don't believe there's a bill on the boards from his administration yet to do this, is the idea of a $15 minimum wage, right? He pivoted in his conversation out of the things that he wants to do in the American Jobs Act to some of the other legislative priorities for his upcoming administration. And there were several of them. Obviously, the Paycheck Fairness Act is a big deal for the Biden administration, but this $15 minimum wage and a right to organize act were points that he wanted to address specifically. And you and I, Phil, both know that you've got the ability to set a national agenda when you're making this kind of a speech. You don't put things in by accident. That combination of a $15 minimum wage, which has been a big progressive talking point, and a specific call out to America's labor community through this right to unionize, that's a pretty progressive vision compared to what we've seen recently. Any reaction?
Yeah, no, I mean, just kind of agreeing with that. I mean, we'll see where it goes with unionization, just because, Well, I mean, as you know, U.S. has always been relatively under unionized, I guess would be the word, compared to other countries. I mean, I frequently I do a unit on this when I do a comparing democracies course. And I frequently ask my students, guess what percentage of the American workforce is unionized, and they always overestimate. By the way, last I looked, it was I think slightly over 10%, and most of that's in the public sector.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean an increase in our unionization rate couldn't make a huge difference, but it is very much on the margins. I worry about the limits of that. I mean, unionization has historically been carried by industrial labor, and the fact is we're in many respects in a post-industrial economy, and that makes it a lot harder at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I have friends, for instance, I got one friend who organizes home healthcare workers, and one problem you run into there is just large groups of people working largely alone, not connected to each other. So, yeah, I mean, for unions, I think I agree with you that the president putting that on the agenda is a very significant step. It does feel like very much, not to be a pessimist, it feels like an uphill battle.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk for a moment or two about what unionization looks like in other countries, right? Because I don't think our audience has any idea what it looks like. To a lot of people, I think union was like, oh, my dad had a union job and he had one experience or another with it. But I don't think a lot of Americans quite understand what a more robustly unionized cross-sectoral bargaining society looks like. Can you talk about that for a second?
I get a little bit. I mean, and I wish I had the numbers right in front of me, but just take an example. I mean, American unionization in the United States peaked in the 1950s, roughly, and peaked at around 35% of the workforce. Mm-hmm. If you look at countries with a much more of a social democratic tradition, say Denmark, Sweden, you're suddenly looking at, in the 1950s, unionization rates of 75%, 90% of the workforce. One reason I bring up the 50s is it has declined across the board. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because the most developed economies have been deindustrializing for a while. And, once again, if industrial labor is sort of always been the core of the union movement, that ends up going down. So, I mean, one basic fact there is the unionization rate in the U.S. is perhaps not uniquely low, but it's definitely at the low end of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. The second thing I would add is the role unions play can be very different. And here I'll give an example. As you know, I've spent a lot of time in Austria, so I'll use that example. But what I'm saying could apply just as well to the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries, Germany to some extent. In Austria and in a lot of other countries, unions are very much built into the decision-making process. To stick with that particular example, they have this concept of a Sozialpartnerschaft, social partnership, this kind of ideology built around the idea that labor and business need each other and together they make up the economy and therefore should work together. How does that work in practice? Well, there is an umbrella organization in Austria and a lot of other countries that represents all unionized labor across the entire country. And there's an umbrella organization that represents all business organizations across the country, and another one representing all farmers across the country. And economic policy making is literally done by those three organizations continuously negotiating with each other on the national level, along with members of the state bureaucracy. I mean, literally meeting to set wage levels across the country. That's something that I think is unimaginable in American political culture. Again, not to be a pessimist, given our low unionization rate, I'm not sure it's actually physically possible in the United States. Mm-hmm. But there are places where that's taken for granted.
Right. And I think that bit of perspective is useful when we look at, the most recent numbers that I saw were like 12% within the public sector, about 6% within the private sector, averaging to 10. They line up with what you've stated. So that I think is a thing. I want people, I guess, to understand that there is a different way of doing things, and that the structure of a strong labor kind of seen, does in fact create these different wage expectations for people across different sectors. It's not as if just having a strong union in shop A only affects that shop. If you've got strong sectoral bargaining, you change the degree to which big issues of like income inequality and individual workers benefit across the board from those kind of changes. So
two comments along those lines. It's always two comments for me. I don't know why. Yeah, I mean, one thing I think critics of unions in the United States associate with unions is sort of this idea that the unions are basically making too big a demand, getting like the argument that, say, auto workers are getting this really cushy deal and it's unsustainable. And I think partly that ends up being a product of the sort of piecemeal union negotiation you get in the United States. All of individual sets of workers that end up getting an extremely good deal, but it doesn't happen across the board. When you've got what you're talking about, sort of like sectoral level negotiations, or what I was talking about, national level negotiations, I think it avoids that. Mm-hmm. And the other kind of surprising side effect of the sort of arrangements I'm talking about, like I said, the sort of things you find in Scandinavia and Austria, Germany, you actually have a lower strike rate. Because if labor and business are used to negotiating with each other regularly, it's a lot easier to cut deals. Sort of like, we can't give huge raises for 5 years because we want to invest in plant, but we'll promise to give you X and Y in 5 years. And if you've got a history of bargaining in good faith, it's actually possible for unions and business leaders to make agreements like that and stick by them.
Yeah.
But again, tougher to do in the United States because we're just not that unionized, and it's really just not built into our decision making.
You've got a fan, sir. It looks like Dr. Dale Nesberry, president of Muskegon Community College, is happy to see you and is thanking me for bringing you on. I'll take complete credit for bringing him here.
I'm very pleased by the compliment. It is coming from my former boss.
So. Right, exactly. Lots of interesting connections here amongst academics in the area. One of the things I want to bring up is we had a comment about the kind of structure of housing. And I think there's a lot of people who end up getting felt like they're left behind. In this case, Kellen's talking about the idea that there's development in the Muskegon housing market and what is considered to be low income, right, amongst working people in Muskegon. Housing being developed here in an attempt to create a tax base. The idea that if you build certain amounts of housing and you appeal to a certain income level, that brings in people who make that kind of money, and that those people then pay into taxes, and that increases the money for local governments and things along those lines, increases the outcome for businesses. But if we're looking at low-income housing available to people who are making more than $65,000 a year, and we've speculated, pure speculation, that Muskegon's income levels can be, half that for a lot of working people and working families, then I think one of the things that does is it exacerbates that feeling of being left behind by national policy, by local policy. And I know that obviously the elements here, this idea of a right to organize, the $15 minimum wage, paycheck fairness, are some of the ways that President Biden is trying to address those things. And I think that while not being pessimistic, it is important to note just how ambitious a lift, right, this potentially is. The president mentioned there's something on the order of 800,000 families on the Medicaid waiting list looking for home care, right, for their children so they can go to work, or for older parents, family members who need that assistance. Obviously, guaranteeing those kind of positions through the American Jobs Act that President Biden has proposed, and also providing a method for those individuals, as you suggested, to connect with one another and potentially unionize, could revolutionize, working families and their situations. Right? You'd have access to childcare, access to elder care, but this is a lot, right? This is a lot. And I think it feeds back into the overall theme that we've been discussing, that this would be a very different way to envision America. I want to talk about
Very different. I'm reinforcing something you said before. Very different, but not actually new.
Yes, yes, I think that's also accurate. That and that's, I think, a perfect segue actually to this idea that we have something like DARPA, right? Which is in many ways an internet grandfather, right? It's the defense projects that gave us the internet. They gave us GPS, right? I think the president said we used to spend more than 2% of our gross domestic product. All the money that we make in the country, 2% of that went into non-defense research, right? Things that we were trying to make because, they would help create national security, but they would also advance, the way of life for Americans. And now we're less than 1% of that, right? We've cut it more than in half at a point in time in which the world seems to be increasingly competitive. So we can look at something like DARPA and go, this was an idea that we've been working with for a while. This idea of this public investment, and under his Jobs Act, I think President Biden is looking to try to stimulate. He mentioned something like a DARPA for the National Institute of Health, right? Actively and proactively working on health issues, developing new technologies and new ideas. That's, again, I think, just to return to the theme here, that's a pretty big vision. Let's talk for a minute about political reality, because that's maybe why you and I are more optimistic, right? There's the possibility of getting a big chunk of this done through budget reconciliation, right? And I think we had a ruling that says not only can you do a budget reconciliation bill once per calendar year, but you can also do a revision bill, right? So realistically, before the 2022 elections, Biden's got 3 bites at the apple if he can't get any kind of bipartisan support on that. Obviously, those have to generally be spending bills that are capable of doing that. But I know you've been, we've both been tuned out a little bit with our own academic responsibilities. But is that where your pessimism is coming from? Is just the possibility of getting it done?
Oh wait, which of my pessimisms? Actually, I mean, in some respects, I don't know if I'm pessimistic about the large agenda. Cautious, maybe. I mean, I think as you've already said, there's a lot of there's possibilities of getting 3 huge pieces of legislation through just through reconciliation. So there's that. The more uncertain part, obviously, is what you do with the rest of the agenda. As you know, there's sort of in the Senate, there's 2 moderate Democrats that have to be kept on board. So that's an ongoing thing. Part of me feels a lot of this has to do with the 2022 midterm. I mean, I'm guessing, first of all, don't claim to be able to predict the future. Don't put any money on anything I'm saying here. But it seems to me the tactic for Democrats in the upcoming midterm election is to run on, look at all we've done for you. Republicans didn't support any of this. Look at all this other stuff we want to do that's popular. Vote in more Democrats and it'll get passed. And maybe that'll work. I mean, historically, the president's party loses seats during midterm, but that's a generalization. Mm-hmm. As I understand it, the Senate map actually looks fairly okay for Democrats this coming year. So that might be it. I mean, some elements of that tactic's already in place. I've seen shots of these billboards that Biden's putting up where they'll announce something that money is going towards in, Kentucky, and there'll be a picture of them on one side of the bulletin of the billboard, taking credit for it, and shots of the state level Republicans, of the Republican representatives from that state who voted against it on the other side, kind of being framed as the bad guys. So, maybe that'll work. Right. Side note, we keep talking back to changes in politics. There's also does seem to be a major effort to make this about policy again.
Yeah.
And not about identity politics, even though on some level it's always, I would argue, about identity politics.
Right. There's going to be some element of intertwining these ideas. And I think that when it comes to some of these issues everybody's connected to the economy, right? So the Jobs Act issues obviously hit to home. but I think some of the appeal there, I think some of what they're banking on, maybe being able to pull some Republican support over for, are some of the things like the things that are in the American Families Plan, because he articulated two different elements. There's this Jobs Act that he wants to move through, which includes the infrastructure spending, and then there's the Families Plan. We're both educators and have a disposition towards supporting that. The line that I remember when he started talking about this Families Plan that I thought was actually pretty effective was that, you know, if we were to stop at one point in time, public education didn't exist in this country, and we looked at the needs of the society and the needs of the economy, and we said, hey, you know what? We need to provide this 12-year education, right? President basically put forward the idea that if we were to do that exact same calculus today, looking at the needs of the society and the needs of the economy, would we say, you know what, 12 years is enough? And he said no. Yeah. Right? And he then articulated the idea of moving to a 16-year plan with 2 years of preschool, noting that it had significant linkages to higher high school completion rates, and then 2 years of community college. Again, expanding this idea of what American government does for people. What do you think that would change?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting to sort of broaden that commitment. I mean, it's strange in that we've always accepted that our tax money provides education for everybody. I mean, at this point, we're just kind of quibbling about the extent of it. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of, on one level, I almost find it strange that adding a couple years on either end seems so radical, though I agree with you, it does. You know, here's another, I always look at this stuff in comparative perspective. It's striking to me how alien the idea of free university is to Americans when that seems to be a norm in so many other places, right? Mm-hmm. You know, we kind of take it for granted that you pay money to go to university, but we also take it granted that you don't pay money to go to elementary school. And I think it's just because the line has been drawn in that one place for so long that a college education has been seen as a privileged special thing that people don't have a right to. And I mean, getting back to this point, I think there's a change of perspective there. I mean, what's going on there is, it seems that idea that you need something like a couple of years of community college to get, you know, the skills you need in a new economy and so forth. You know, obviously, you know, this is my bread and butter, so I'd love to see guaranteed free college education for everybody. But, you know,
sure, right.
That's in my, whatever social good that serves, that's also probably in my my economic self-interest.
Right, yeah, we will cop to this bias immediately, I think.
But, yeah, I mean, the very idea that we could extend that into preschool, I think, is radical, just given the fact that it's not part of most people's expectations.
So I want to return to the comments here real quick before we move on, even though we somewhat predictably, Phil and I are a little bit all over the place when it comes to what's going on here. Kellen feels that my estimates for income are accurate, and basically he's asking, so where do we see, where do you see the middle development sees poverty? And I think that's more of a statement. But she also says she's alluding to the constantly changing class labels and what it means for things like prescribed housing for the poor. We do need to get back to eventually what President Biden closes with, but I think this is worth a couple minutes.
That's right. This is about Biden's speech.
Yeah, I know. We do this, but I think the point Kellen is getting at here is, yeah, this idea that Biden is making these kind of broad appeals to the middle class, right? But there's a lot of people who I think, while they're maybe aspirational to the middle class, don't feel middle class, right? And a lot of people for whom many of the things that have been designed to try to help, American workers and alleviate elements aren't really getting to them because they are accurately, realistically, in the structure of our economy, they're poor, right? And I do want to point out that rhetoric. She's talking about these class labels, and I think there's she's got a point, right? That poverty and its stigma make frequently dealing with poverty hard. I think there's a lot of conception that, the many people in this country who are poor of their own failing, right? And that if they were to be working, they wouldn't be poor anymore. When the reality is that, the vast majority and number of people who are poor in this country are working as well, right? They're just simply not making enough to escape from the kind of systemic traps that keep people in poverty and impose those issues. And I know that when Biden calls for like the permanent extension of those child tax credits, those refundable child tax credits, he's talking about the idea that this will be the most significant blow to child poverty, against child poverty that we've seen maybe in the history of the country. And I guess I don't want to walk away from Kellen's point without pointing at that, class kind of idea and Americans reconciling with poverty. Is there any thoughts or international examples we can look at for how you deal with this?
Oh, wow. We have, unfortunately, no surprise. My mind just went in several different directions with this. I mean, part is, I think I alluded to before, the way class is used in the United States is very kind of flexible. This sense that everyone in a way claims to be middle class in that sense. And I also agree with you. I mean, I think there's enough of a stigma on poverty in this country that it makes it harder historically, it's made it harder to put through various kinds of social programs. It's something I find baffling on some level, partly. I mean, it seems part of like the script a lot of us have in our heads, or a lot of what we're told is, well, people don't have jobs because they're lazy, but unemployment's cyclical, right? It's not like every few years, millions of people suddenly got lazier and stopped working. Mm-hmm. And then I think, the real kind of perverse part about that you just mentioned, the fact that poor people are more often than not working poor people. Mm-hmm. So that's one kind of set of thoughts on that. It's also probably worth keeping in mind, politically, this is important, how much this isn't just about income, but it's about status. And I have a very specific example in mind. A few years ago, I was reading an interview with a coal miner who was a Trump supporter. And it was, one of these pieces trying to like interview people who supported Trump and figure out why. And I'm listening to this guy talking. It's like coal miner, by definition, a blue collar job. Mm-hmm. And at some point, it comes out that this guy's earning $70,000 a year, which is far above the median. Mm-hmm. And not, I think by probably the standards of most people listening to this, not a bad income at all. And I'm listening to him realizing, okay, so he's actually doing well. First of all, given where he lived, I suspect he's supporting a much broader set of family off of that income. So that $70,000 may not carry him as far as it would be for someone else living a different part of the country, living in the suburbs somewhere. But more importantly, I'm looking at saying, yes, okay, this is someone who's earning 70 grand a year and is, proud of being a coal miner. But he's facing the possibility that if that job goes away, he's fighting over a job being a greeter at Walmart. Yeah. And that's a huge step down in income. And I'd say, given what this man was saying, I would say a huge step down for him in terms of his sense of his own status in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a big dynamic of what's going on right there, right now. I mean, I think that, there's a lot of people in this country who want, there's definitely people in this country who need maybe a boost, but there's also a lot of people who want reassurance.
I think that's accurate. I think we can look at the terms poor, working class, and middle class, and go, yeah, I mean, there's not hard boundaries on any of these things, and to a great extent, it is a little bit about status. It's about ego, right? It's about feeling like you're a success in a world that frequently does use the amount of dollars you have in your bank account as measurement for that success, right? So
and all this goes back to, emphasize the beginning on Biden's choice of that phrase, working families. Everyone has a family and everyone thinks of themselves as someone who works. So it's sort of a useful phrase. And getting back to the viewer's comment, yeah, I mean, these are loose categories, but in some ways, right. I think that's what makes them.
So we've only got a few minutes left. And one of the things that I want to get to here is that one of the lines I think that stuck out from Biden's entire presentation was the idea that America is back, is something that he's been saying to foreign leaders. And their response has, to an extent, been, okay, great, but for how long? And he gave the impression that, he's getting, and we've seen this in international press, serious doubts and consternation about the state and strength of the American economy. And more than that, the state and strength of the American democracy. So the argument that has been circulating amongst some authoritarian circles, and the argument that's trying to be made by some individuals even here, is that democracy, especially when we are divided, is too inefficient to stand up to the challenges of the 21st century, right? Biden was trying to make a pretty vociferous argument against that point and in favor of democracy. And I think President Biden made it pretty clear that he looks at something like H.R. 1, the significant expansion of voting rights and access and protection, as being a crucial part of guaranteeing that our democracy really remains the voice of the people. And he creates a pretty significant contrast, right, to a potential future in which voting is harder and people of fewer means, people of color, people who are living in urban environments have less of a voice. So since I happen to have somebody with some expertise in comparative democracy, my question to you is, effectively, what is the state of the health of American democracy, and what does it look like if we start moving down one of these two paths?
Wow. I really don't have enough minutes left for that question. Couple really sweeping points, and I don't know, you're going to have me back to go into more detail. The first one is these problems are not unique to the United States. I mean, around the world, you're watching political movements that are questioning democracy, that are frequently supported by people who are concerned about their future economic status, but also about their status relative to immigrants or other groups of people that they see as other than themselves. And that is a global phenomenon driven by a lot of things. A lot of it's just driven by the globalization of the economy, and obviously the recent recession did not help that at all. So, and the U.S. is bound up into that. To the extent that the U.S. has withdrawn from its role as a democracy supporter in the last 4 years, that doesn't help, but it's not just about us. I guess the other general point I have to make is these are not new problems. Just to stick on one particular thing, the crisis of political polarization we're dealing with right now has its roots in 1965 and a series of changes in the demographics of the American population and the electorate since then. And President Trump being in office or being out of office doesn't change that. I mean, he's part of that whole phenomenon, but we've got some longer term stuff to deal with there. And I guess I don't know how many minutes we have left, but my larger sense about this is the key factor for me in terms of American politics is what the Republican Party decides to be. Right now, the Republican Party looks like it's sort of floundering about what its identity is, and I do not think they're going to have an answer to that question until fall 2024, because that's when these things in America, parties tend to be redefined by presidents. Mm-hmm. And it depends. I mean, in 2012, the Republicans did an internal audit and basically said, wow, we've got a shrinking support base. We really need to broaden who our voters are, or we're just going to be in a permanent minority. What they've done since then is use a lot of the tools available to them to maximize how much power they can have, even though they're a minority party effectively. We could be looking for another 4 years of that starting in 2024. We could look at a Republican turnaround, and I don't claim to be able to predict that. I'm not sure anybody knows the answer.
Right, and it's disturbing, I think, when we see things like the very hyper-partisan, undocumented recount effort going on in Arizona right now. That's essentially being conducted in furtherance of former President Trump's lie that there was, some kind of malfeasance in the previous election. There are reasons why I think President Biden felt that he had to comment a little bit about shoring up the structure of American democracy, and why I think there's a lot of bipartisan support, at least amongst the public, for the contents of H.R. 1 and things like making sure that the American political war, however it looks, is carried out in the hearts and minds of everyone, right? And that if you're going to make an argument about whether we should or should not do something, the way to win that argument is to appeal to enough other human beings in this country that you can get a majority, not rig the rules one way or another. So we're nearly out of time. We've covered half of what we wanted to cover and also twice what we thought we could. Any last words before we sign off, Phil?
Yeah, just one last follow-up on that. I mean, and this is sort of my words to Democrats and then to Republicans, which is if you're going to live in a democracy, you want at least two functioning parties. And, you know, I mean, from a Democrat's point of view, you want Republicans being a viable opposition who wins some of the time with a majority of the American support, because otherwise you don't live in a democracy. And, you know, my thoughts for Republicans is, if you support a lot of goals of the Republican Party, or you have a set of things you wish were goals for the Republican Party, and you also support political democracy, then your party needs to find a way to get a majority of support from American people, and doesn't really have that right now.
Right.
So, getting back with Biden's speech, one thing he has going for him is just, in most policy areas, people really favor Democrats right now, and the polling is really stunning on that. And all these sweeping things he wanted to do, like you said, have broad support. You know, gun reform of the kind he's supporting has broad support, voting reform down the line.
Right. And I think at the end of it, you're right. It's about getting back to the people and making sure their will is true in government. I think that's the truth we were looking for, and it's about all the truth we can afford in this hour. I want to thank WUVS 103.7 The Beat. I want to thank PA and Lady J. We miss you, Greg. We can't wait to have you back. This has been Torn Into, your local news show. I'm David Taki. My guest was Philip J. Howe. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
On behalf of everyone in our community,